Okay, we are all good to go. We are being recorded on WebEx and are also live on YouTube, so we can get started.
Hey, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. We apologize for the slight delay getting started. We're back in New York City, so we're trying to get adjusted to our bearings here. Welcome to our final DNA Subcommittee meeting of 2024. At this time, I'll take attendance to establish a quorum. We will conduct the business today through roll call, as we have members present both here in New York City and virtually. So please respond present when I call on you. Dr. Bieber.
Fred Bieber, present.
Dr. Corrado.
Present.
Dr. Gettings.
Present.
Dr. Kidd.
Present.
Dr. Smith.
Present.
And Dr. Sozier.
Amanda Sozier, present.
Thank you. And including myself, we have established a quorum. Our first item on our agenda is we have received a draft agenda for today's meeting. There is a late sort of document that came to us on Wednesday that we may wish to discuss on today's agenda. I'll ask a little bit of background if you would like.
Sure. The subcommittee received, I believe, on Wednesday, a letter concerning the OCME, investigation into an issue with certain bleach. The subcommittee has received the letter. The letter has been provided to the subcommittee members, and the subcommittee may vote to add it to its agenda, the agenda today.
The discussion could take place during the discussion of the event, which is item 7B currently.
Okay, so there is a space in the agenda for time that we could discuss this if we wish, but since it's not technically part of the agenda, I was just wanting to ask if there's anyone that would wish to discuss the agenda. If not, then do I have a motion to approve the agenda for this meeting?
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Do I have a second?
Second.
Dr. Gettings. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kidd. We've seconded the motion. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is aye. Dr. Bieber.
Fred Bieber, aye.
Dr. Corrado.
Aye.
Dr. Gettings.
Aye.
Dr. Kidd.
Ed Kidd, aye.
Dr. Smith.
Aye.
And Dr. Sozier.
Amanda Sozier, aye.
Okay, the agenda has been approved. The motion carries. Next item is to review and approve the draft minutes from the August 9th, 2024 meeting. We've received the draft minutes from that August 9th meeting. Is there any discussion regarding these minutes? Okay. Seeing no one raising their hand or making any sign, do I have a motion to accept the minutes of the August 9th, 2024 meeting?
So moved.
I have a motion from Dr. Smith. Do I have a second?
Second.
Dr. Gettings has seconded the motion. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is aye. Dr. Bieber.
Fred Bieber, aye.
Dr. Corrado.
Aye.
Dr. Gettings.
Aye.
Dr. Kidd.
Ed Kidd, aye.
Dr. Smith.
Aye.
And Dr. Sozier.
Amanda Sozier, aye.
Okay. Next up is accreditation and laboratory updates. We'll start with the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. We do have members from the lab that are available to speak virtually. The laboratory has received confirmation from the FBI that based on a review of their QAS audit conducted in April, the laboratory is in compliance with the external audit requirements and the FBI's quality assurance standards. Congratulations. Are there any questions for the laboratory? Okay. This is no vote required, so thank you very much. Next up is the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Division of Forensic Services. This is just for informational purposes, so no vote is required. We do have members of the laboratory available to speak. In October, the laboratory underwent a surveillance activity and there were no findings. The lab is waiting for other final documents at the moment from ANAB. Does anyone have any questions for the laboratory? Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences Laboratory. We will have a vote to issue a binding recommendation. We do have a member of the lab available to speak. Back in September, the laboratory underwent a full re-accreditation assessment activity. This included an external QAS audit. There were no findings, but one opportunity for improvement was suggested. The assessor felt that the lab would benefit from standardizing the process for establishing a time frame for completion of each corrective action. It should be noted that recommendations such as these require no action. So do I have a motion to issue a binding recommendation to the Commission on Forensic Sciences to renew the New York State accreditation for the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences Laboratory in the discipline of biology for the period concurrent with its ANAB accreditation set to expire January 31st, 2029?
So moved.
I have a motion from Dr. Gettings. Do I have a second?
Second.
Dr. Smith has seconded the motion. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is yes. Dr. Bieber,
Fred Bieber, yes.
Dr. Corrado,
Yes.
Dr. Gettings,
Yes.
Dr. Kidd,
Ken Kidd, yes.
Dr. Smith,
Yes.
and Dr. Sozer.
Amanda Sozer, yes.
Thank you. The motion carries. Next up on our agenda is the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. We do have members of the laboratory available to speak if there are any questions. There's no vote required for this next part. Back in August, yes, Dr. Sozer,
Oh.
sorry.
Finish, and I just have a comment. Sorry, I jumped in too fast.
Okay. Back in August, the laboratory underwent a surveillance activity. There were no findings. ANAB has issued the continuation of accreditation documents. The lab completed an internal QAS document in August, and there were no findings. The laboratory has notified ANAB and the FBI that Carrie Anito will be replacing Helen Wong as the DNA technical leader. Are there any questions for the laboratory?
Mike, I just had one
Dr.
comment. I'm just trying to get to it. At the end of the document where there are forms that need to be filled out, they were left blank. And I think that it would be helpful, like, for example, on page 150 of our documents, it would be helpful to just either say NA or something to show that they did address that page and it wasn't applicable. So like page 150, page 151, page 152 of our document. So it's 59, 58, and 57 of theirs.
So just something that notes either in that, I see in that section 3 and the appendix and so forth.
Yes. Rather than leaving it blank. I
Okay.
assume they're probably listening on the phone.
We can pull them up to ensure that they are.
Yes, we have a representative. Inga Dorfman is available.
Good morning.
Here we go. Hi, Inga.
Hi, I'm here with Carrie Anito and Karen Galindo from the biology section and Constance Nickel, our director. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
Sorry, because I'm
So-
referencing, oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead. You have the question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think it's good practice. So I was looking at your audit document, and in our materials, we have a page, and then you have a page on your audit document as well. So in our materials, it started on page 150, but on your audit document, it was page 57 of 59. And it probably was not applicable to your laboratory, but I think it's good practice to either write NA or none needed or something so that you know that those areas were addressed instead of just leaving it blank.
Okay, I think we tried to do that, so if we didn't do it this time, that wasn't intentional. But there are also comments at the end.
For clarification, Inga, you did do that on Appendix A, and I think Dr. Sozer, you're referring to Appendix D. So on Appendix D, there's blank spots.
Okay,
Right, Appendix D, Appendix, and Appendix E.
okay, thank you, we'll take a look at that.
Okay,
This
now,
is Kathy Corrado. Can I just add to that a little bit?
Yeah.
I think, I might be wrong, but I think that I totally agree with what Mandy's saying. But I honestly think that that's the assessors that need to put the NA. I don't think the lab can actually put the NA. The lab can ask the assessors now perhaps to put it in, but I believe that that has to be filled out by the assessors, unless someone else on the thinks I'm incorrect on that.
correct, but I think this was a self-assessment, right?
Yes, this was.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Okay, thank you.
You're
So
absolutely
sorry.
right.
So sorry.
You're absolutely right.
And that hand raising thing is odd in WebEx, I'm just saying.
Okay, so since this is a self-assessment, then it would be appropriate or okay if the laboratory would just enter the NA in those empty boxes.
Sure, I think so. It does say to be completed by an external team, so I think NA is the most appropriate then.
Sure. Okay, any other questions for the laboratory? All right. The next item is the Westchester County Department of Labs and Research Division of Forensic Science. We do have members from the laboratory available to speak, and we will vote to issue a binding recommendation. Back in June, the laboratory underwent a full reaccreditation assessment activity. This included an external QAS audit. The laboratory initially received 5 findings, with 1 related to biology. The biology-related finding regarding an intermediate check for a genetic analyzer was challenged, and this nonconformity was removed. The challenge document was provided and reviewed at the August subcommittee meeting, so we saw that previously. The laboratory remediated the 4 non-DNA or biology-related findings, and ANAB has issued renewal of accreditation documents. So, do I have a motion to issue a binding recommendation to the Commission on Forensic Science to renew the New York State accreditation of the Westchester County Department of Laboratories and Research Division of Forensic Science in the discipline of biology for the period concurrent with its ANAB accreditation set to expire October 31st, 2028. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Dr. Smith has made the motion. Do I have a second? Dr. Gettings has seconded the motion. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is aye. Dr. Bieber,
Fred Bieber, aye.
Dr. Corrado,
Aye.
Dr. Gettings,
Aye.
Dr. Kidd,
Ken Kidd, aye.
Dr. Smith,
Aye.
and Dr. Sozer.
Amanda Sozer, aye.
Thank you. The motion carries. Our last item is the New York City OCME Department of Forensic Biology, an assessment report. We do have members of the laboratory present here in the room. There's no vote required for this. In October, the laboratory underwent a surveillance activity and there were no findings. The lab is waiting for their final documents from ANAB. Does anyone have any questions for the laboratory? Okay, hearing none, this finishes the new business. We'll go to our next section, which is old business. So first up is a partial match update. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Ms. Palmer and she'll give us an update regarding the partial match program.
And since the next item after that is familial search, I'll just do both if that's all right.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. As far as the partial match program goes, there are no updates. We remain the same as we have pretty consistently for some time now. There were 93 total applications and 49 names had been released. The other 44 were unable to confirm with additional testing, and all 49 investigations are considered closed, and there were 2 convictions based on that program. As the familial search program is back up and running, there are updates. We're seeing some upticks in applications. Since our August meeting, there have been 5 applications received by our office. 3 of those are new initial applications and 2 are renewal applications. 2 of the 5 have been approved at this point, and there have been 2 searches completed, and there's with no results. So in total, the program has 64 applications, 48 unique original ones, 8 renewals, and 8 resubmissions. 44 have been approved, 13 were rejected initially, 3 were withdrawn, and 4 are currently in the review process of no status yet. Of the approved, 6 are in the search queue, 38 searches have been completed, 27 had no results to release, 11 had names released. There are 6 open cases and 5 closed cases. So 2 arrests and the first conviction has happened.
Excellent. Does anyone have any questions on the partial match or familial search update? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the next item, which is CODIS bulletins. It's my understanding that Tom Leach has notified OFS that there are no relevant CODIS bulletins at this time. Next, the NIST Interagency Report. The co-chair of the BioTwig, Craig O'Connor, is here to provide additional feedback on the NIST report. I'd like to invite Craig to the table and give us an update if you'd like to. Thank you, Craig.
Morning. At the last BioTwig meeting, we had again discussed the what we call the human factors report. I believe this was based on some questions that were brought out at the last commission meeting. We just wanted to again iterate that these are a list of recommendations and best practices that the interagency or that NIST put out. Laboratories are evaluating it. Laboratories in New York State are evaluating it to see if any of them are things that they wish to adopt. At BioTwig, we looked at those and again saw that the laboratories are following most of those recommendations. There are some that we had a limited discussion about. There are a couple that were conflicted with some of the other standards that are out there. There are standards, there are best recommendations, there are SWGDAM recommendations, like there are a list of different recommendations out there. So this will just be added to those lists of recommendations that the BioTwig labs will evaluate as best practices.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. O'Connor? I see Dr. Corrado.
Thank you. Good morning, Craig. Just one
Morning.
question I have is relating to, I think we talked a little bit about it at the last meeting, the report wording standards, the New York State report wording standards. And I just want to verify that the BioTwig or whatever group, I think it's BioTwig, that is looking at the report wording standards and comparing them to some of the recommendations in the human factors. I mean, I agree with what you said that they're just recommendations and some of them do conflict with some other documents, but I'll just call the recommendations out that I noticed that I thought probably apply to the report wording documents. And those are recommendations in the human factors 4.2, 4.3, 4.5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and then section 4.6.2. So I would just like, if you can't give the confirmation now, that's fine, but I would just like to be sure that the BioTwig looked at those recommendations and then, made a decision whether or not to change any of the report wording guidelines based on that.
Yes, we actually did take a hard look at the report standardization wording. We spent quite some time on it, and we have sent over, I should say, we did look at those wordings in along with the NIST recommendations as we are trying to revise the report standardization, and we sent a draft report or draft comments over to NICLAC to take a look at. So it's in the process right now. I'm sure they're going to take a look at it. There'll be several back and forth and discussions about it, but we did look at both the recommendations and the report standardization.
Great, thank you. That's good to hear. I guess I would just ask DCJS if at the time when the new report wording is finalized, if the DNA subcommittee could have could also be given a copy of that. I mean, I know it's posted, but it'd be nice if we could just be given a copy just to look it over as well after they're finalized.
We could provide that, certainly.
Thank you.
I'll just let you know, and I'm sure Kathy, you're well aware, but with all of the different disciplines that contribute to this document, it might be a while. So the bio group is one of 10 groups contributing to some updates. So we anticipate sometime in 2025 being able to have a final document to provide, but we'll let you know.
Great, sounds good. Thank you.
Super. Any other questions for Dr. O'Connor? Seeing none, then Greg, thank you so much. We'll now move to new business. And first up is the annual CODIS security audit. And so I'll turn this over to Ms. Palmer to provide us with some information regarding the annual CODIS security audit.
Certainly. So this is something that the Office of Forensic Services does annually based on the state statute and regulations. We perform these CODIS security audits. Our staff traveled around to the different labs this summer to conduct the audits in person. The previous year had been a paper audit, so this was an on-site audit. We want to thank all of the labs for accommodating the staff and getting them in a timely manner and having everything prepared and easily accessible to review. We found no issues this year, so there's no findings to report, and everyone remains in compliance with their security for CODIS.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you very much for the update. Next up on the agenda are laboratory disclosures. We'll start with the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Division of Forensic Services. We do have members of the laboratory available to speak. The laboratory has closed out the corrective action regarding an inadvertent custody transfer in the laboratory's information management LIMS system, which was first discussed at our last meeting in August. The laboratory has made a note in each of the affected cases and completed an inventory of chemistry, latent prints, firearms, and biology section evidence in their vaults. No additional cases were found with issues related to the LIMS software issue. Are there any questions for the laboratory? Okay. Seeing none,
I
we'll
had a
move on to-
question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mike,
It's
I
hard for
had
me
a
to see the
question.
little.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Dr. Sozier. Please
I
go
had a
ahead.
question too. I guess I didn't understand. They found another issue with chain of custody, but it wasn't related to the limbs on 2 cases.
We'll get the lab.
Yep, we'll bring the lab up here.
I'm here. Is Mark here?
Yes, Mark is available as well.
Okay, great.
Karen, it's Mandy Sozer, and I was just curious about that when you did this audit, you had 2 cases that had updates to the chain when Was that an issue that you had found?
So Karen, I could take this question.
Perfect.
So
Okay.
when we did the evidence inventory as a follow-up to monitor this corrective action, we discovered that there were 2 items of evidence that were in the general location, but on the incorrect shelf. So we updated those records, did a notation, and then notified our customers because discovery was released for those cases.
And then they were just placed on the wrong, or identified, the wrong shelf was identified, or the wrong location was identified.
Right. It was in the vault area, we get very granular with our location, so it was just on the wrong shelf in that specific evidence location.
Okay.
Are there any other questions, or Dr. Sozier, does that satisfy your question? Do you have any other questions?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for the lab? Okay. Thank you very much, Karen and Mark, for jumping on.
I'm sorry, Mike, I had one other question.
Yes. Okay.
I didn't know why, sorry, it was on the next page. I didn't know why the technical leader didn't sign the form.
So we determined that it really wasn't like a scientific technical issue. It was just more of a computer issue, like an IT issue.
Okay.
So that's why we didn't have the technical leader sign it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. And
Yeah, I just need to go back on the record about the CODIS audits. We also conduct SAVIS security audits. And this year, our SAVIS audits were on site and our CODIS audits were on paper. So I had them swapped in my mind. So I just want to make it clear for the record that it was an on-site for our SAVIS audits and a paper audit for the CODIS audits. Thank you.
okay.
My
thank you.
apologies.
No worries. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mark and Karen, for your assistance. Does anyone have any other final questions for Nassau County? Okay, we'll move on next to the New York City OCME Department of Forensic Biology. We do have members of the lab available here in the room to speak. And this is, again, the issue that we talked about earlier of the document that we received on Wednesday. So this is a notification of case-to-case contamination. A temporary pause was placed on evidence examination, issuing new reports, and CODIS profiles. The lab is investigating the root cause. A different cleaning reagent was purchased, and lab areas were thoroughly cleaned. Training on best cleaning practices was provided, and examination of evidence has now resumed. The New York City Council was notified, and a root cause analysis committee was put together to further investigate the issue. The committee provided their report earlier this month with recommendations for the laboratory. The root cause analysis report has also been distributed to the lab, by the lab, to the executive director of the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. ANAB has been notified and acknowledged the issue. Are there any questions for the laboratory?
I have some questions, Mike, but
Yes.
before we start the questions, I'm not sure. Oh, there it goes. I was just going to say that I anyway couldn't see the meeting until just now. I popped back on. So, but I don't know if everyone else online had that issue, or was it just my computer? Okay.
Okay. Okay, we do have members of the laboratory that are at the table now, and their microphones are on, so hopefully everyone can hear. So, Dr. Prado, do you want to start with your questions?
Sure. And I have about 5 or 6, so I can go through them. But if anyone wants to jump in at any time too, let me know and I'll defer. Thanks, OCME, for being here. My first question is, and it relates to the RCA information that we were given. And on your page 4 of 11, it states in relation to the CODIS database, it states that none of the DNA profiles that have been removed from CODIS had resulted in a CODIS hit to a convicted offender. And I guess my question is, were there any local or case-to-case CODIS hits? Because I would assume that if you had similar samples in different cases, that they would have resulted in a case-to-case hit.
Yes, I'll just make sure we know who's here. Craig O'Connor, Deputy Director, Forensic Biology Department.
Tiffany Vasquez, DNA Technical Leader.
Meredith Rosenberg, Deputy Director, Forensic Biology.
Allison Nixon, Counsel.
So as far as the question about case to case, yes, there were a couple of case to case where, so we have, a certain number of cases that were the contaminating profiles, and then a certain number of cases that were contaminated. And sometimes there were multiple cases contaminated by the same contaminating profile. So that would result in a local case-to-case hit between those cases.
And so when those hits were identified or were made, was it after you found out about this, or did those go out as association letters?
So the first instance that we detected of contamination, that was how we detected it, was through that case-to-case hit. And we have like a DNA hit checklist when we have a local hit to look at all of those things. Like, were the cases processed on the same batch? Could there have been a sample switch? Were they processed by the same examiner on the same day? And that's how we detected the first instance.
Okay, that's good. So there were no letters that went out then to anyone about these matches?
So there was, I believe, at least one that did go out on a different set of cases. So in that instance, it was a victim profile from a sexual assault kit that had contaminated 2 property crimes cases. And we don't compare victims of sexual assault kits, by route to any other cases. And so the 2 property crimes cases hit to each other. They did notice that it was examined on the same day, but based on the case type and the MO and everything like that, they thought it was a legitimate hit. It looked like these 2 cases could be related. So that particular local hit was issued, but it didn't hit any known person. Right. And so as soon as we figured out that it could be potential contamination after the first, I think, like 2 instances, we asked the analysts to kind of look at all their cases. Do you remember anything weird? And this analyst raised their hand and said, hey, can we take a closer look at this one? And then we, retracted those profiles out of CODIS.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy, can I follow up just on that? So when you had the contamination between the sexual assault kit and the other cases, was it always the reference, the victim standard that was contaminating, or were there other samples in that case that were the contaminator?
Right. So most often it actually wasn't the reference standard. It was the kit, like intimate samples that were being processed. So the examiner would process the entire sexual assault kit for, let's say, male screening. And so they were making a cutting from every single orifice and intimate sample, as well as samples from the underwear that all had a ton of the victim's DNA on it, right? So they had millions of picograms of DNA of the victim. And that would lead to a contamination to the property crimes kind of low template touch sample that they processed next. So that was the most common type of contamination that we saw throughout our investigation.
Right. In fact, for for a percentage of our kits, since we do male screening, we will actually hold off on processing the victim exemplar unless we have male positive samples. So there were some instances where the victim exemplar wasn't even processed for those kits, but because the orifice swabs were cut previously, that's where the victim DNA ended up being on that property crimes case that was processed afterwards.
Mandy, do you have any follow-up or anybody else?
I have.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And I truly appreciate the effort you guys have put in to track this down. I know it involved just 9 criminalists, correct?
Yes.
And how confident are you that from the beginning of the time, and I know they passed proficiency tests, so that's good. This high level to low is, we've seen it before, even in old serology days. How confident are you that from the time these 9 criminalists came on and started working cases, that they didn't have some of these habits? I know you've set a timeline for the review of cases, and you think you've gotten it. So, and it kind of goes to more of the question of, I know we've talked about the bleach and all that kind of stuff, but it also just talks to the criminalists themselves and what they were doing. So I know you have to pick a time frame sometimes, but I just wondered if you could walk me through that thinking.
Right. The investigation is still ongoing.
Okay.
And, we will be taking a look at the timeline itself. We kind of concentrated the timeline because all the cases that we were seeing were within May, June, and July, or June and July. So we kind of bookended May and August as well. And we took a look at all the cuttings in that time frame. Based on the results that we saw during that block of months, we are now going to also work backwards as well, and which was one of the recommendations of the RCA committee. So it's still ongoing,
So
and
you will continue to go back.
Yes.
And then the other thing is, and I'm sure these criminalists are taking this all very much to heart, but it also goes to sort of looking at your training, and if the criminalists appreciate the beginning to end process as they're doing their training. And I know that can be hard when you're training a lot of people and, things happen, but that they appreciate when they're holding that swab, that it's high levels and things like that. So I'm sure you're having lots of conversations about it, but it is something sometimes that, when you have that many people involved in a process, that can happen. So
Yes. Yeah, we definitely have re-emphasized, and I think, like Dr. Coble mentioned, we retrained not just, we hadn't discovered all 9 at that point, but we retrained everybody in the entire laboratory. Everyone from supervisor to examiner had to go through a mandatory retraining where we sort of aligned, these are absolutely the best practices that we want. And we documented them in more detail, put them through a competency test. If they're still touching samples, like the supervisors don't touch the samples, so they had to do the demo, but the examiners had to do a competency test where they cut high template samples, did the proper cleaning, cut low template cut a blank sample to make sure that that sample was still blank on a couple of those rounds before they were allowed to touch evidence again. So it was reemphasized many times over, for sure.
And it looked like too, you're using more disposables.
Yes.
So though it's costs
Yes.
a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, going through gloves and everything like that, and then more disposable scalpels,
Yes.
even to the point of disposable scissors. I mean, because we're at such a low template world these days.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
anyway.
we've definitely switched over to disposable scalpels for the majority of items, and for like a single sexual assault kit, they will use one scalpel and then that
Mhm.
scalpel goes in the trash.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah, it's a lot of work.
As well,
And-
as well as separating out, or I should say, changing the schematic of the
Yeah.
evidence examination room.
Yeah.
Exemplars are processed in one area, samples where we expect to get high amounts of DNA in a different area, samples where we expect to get low amounts of DNA in a
Yeah.
separate area, and also an area for processing sexual assault kits. We are fortunate we have that much space in order to do that. I know most laboratories don't, but we have an entire lab floor for evidence examination that we have kind of partitioned out for what would be expected on those items of evidence.
I have another
Prado.
question. Sorry.
Yes.
So, and I agree with what Dr. Smith said. I mean, you guys done an incredible job with looking into this issue. But I guess I have a question about, it seems like the RCA, from what I've read, from what it looks like to me, focused on the cleaning technique and the evidence exam. And I'm just wanting to ask, were there other avenues that were looked at least in the root cause, such as, pipetting, or, carryover of gloves getting stuck in tubes, or like, any kind of tube handling or instrument carryover? Were those things looked at as part of the RCA?
So as far as the sample types, like I mentioned, the majority were from the sexual assault kits over to like a property crime swab or a gun swab. And downstream of evidence exam, those were on separate batches, right? So they weren't being processed together anymore. They were different sample types and case types. And so the sexual assault samples would go on batch A and the gun samples would go on batch B, and downstream of that, they were not processed together. So we definitely did look at that. As far as evidence exam and gloves and things like that, when we reinforced the sort of best cleaning and training practices, we emphasized increased changing of the PPE, increased cleaning of, the benches, and best practices for getting your tubes out of only getting tubes for that particular case, and things like that, and how often they should be cleaning their racks and everything. So it was not just the tools, but also their whole bench and PPE, regime.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy, can I follow up onto that question? Because I believe there was one instance where there was one sample that contaminated 4 other cases.
Yes, that was the first instance that was detected.
And so were those 4 cases, was there one case that was processed and then 4 others after that?
Yeah, so the examiner had examined a piece of evidence, I believe it was a cotton ball with blood on it, and that was sort of the contaminating sample. And then they had processed a number of other cases throughout the day. Not all of them showed contamination. We did, based on interviews, we know that the analysts were using, let's say, multiple pairs of scissors. So we're attributing that to sort of one pair of scissors, what had the sort of contaminating profile, and the others did not, because it kind of skipped over samples throughout the day. But it was all that blood profile. Again, like that blood sample had an incredibly high amount of DNA. They remembered it as sort of being kind of flaky and crusty. There's a chance that there was like a flake of blood that just didn't get removed in the cleaning process throughout the day, and may have contributed to contaminating those other samples. We did kind of see the contamination sort of decrease throughout the day, right? So at like the first case that it contaminated, it was at a higher level, but then it decreased and was much lower level by the end of the day.
I should add, Dr. Sozer, that our LIMS system, we were able to actually track chronologically when the samples were created and cut. So that certainly helped us in the evaluation and investigation. So we were able to see that that blood sample was cut first thing in the morning, And then the subsequent samples were cut after that chronologically by time.
And so you think that they used different instruments, and that's why maybe case 2 didn't have contamination, but her 3rd case did, and her 4th case didn't, and her 5th case did?
Right. Exactly. Yes.
May I ask another question, unless anyone else has a follow-up? Okay. Sorry. Sorry, Mike, I don't know. It's hard being away.
Please
So,
go ahead.
Another question I had was in relation to your, I guess your corrective action is that it says that you've implemented this cross-contamination check of process samples. You're randomly selecting criminalists to review. Can you just explain what that process is? Because I'm just curious, that seems really manually intensive. So I'm just curious how you're going to accomplish that.
Right. So we, like Craig mentioned, we can query out of our limbs, the cuttings made by a particular examiner on a particular day or over a multi-day period, and see those samples in chronological order. So what we're doing is it's for 2 examiners, and this was intended to monitor that our corrective actions are working appropriately, right? Like all of these cleaning techniques and everything that everyone has been retrained, and the separation of items and evidence exam is all working appropriately. So for 2 examiners a week, for 3 days for each examiner, we are querying their cuttings out of our limbs. And then we create sort of a batch list. And for any DNA profiles that were generated from samples within that list that are at least like half a profile or more, so 11 loci or more, we'll add them to a list. And then we use StarMix to compare using a batch mode, those profiles to any mixtures that were generated from samples in that same 3-day period. And we have it screened. We report out based on an uninformative range. So we use 1,000 as our cutoff, an LR, and any LRs above 1,000 will investigate to see if it could have resulted from potential cross-contamination between cases. So this is done sort of after it's done by a supervisor, after this technical review process is completed for those cases to ensure that the profiles are all, set. And then they'll run this batch. Typically a manager or a quality control or assistant technical leader will review that batch. And then the cases are released if everything looks good, and we'll put a memo in that it was randomly chosen for this QC process.
That's good. That's intensive. That sounds good. Is there any, I thought that StarMix has a mixture-to-mixture comparison feature. Is that something that you can employ, or is it that you have too many samples for that?
Right. So a number of things. So we don't have, the mixture-to-mixture, I think in the version of StarMix it was maybe the first release of it. So it's not quite as advanced as future versions. We don't have that internally validated. It's not something that we have online. So it would take us a number of months to validate that if we wanted to use it. We also took a look at the contamination events that we were able to detect. And all of them, I think, like I mentioned earlier, came from a contaminating sample that had, thousands to millions of nanograms of DNA. And then a very small portion of that, usually like less than 0.1% or less than 1% of that DNA ended up on the contaminated sample. So the vast majority of our mixtures they don't have millions of picograms of DNA, right? The ones that do have that much DNA to serve as a contaminating sample are typically like a robust donor, right? A blood sample, semen sample, an orifice sample, things like this. So We don't know that the mixture to mixture would be fruitful for detecting further contamination because we don't think those samples are likely to serve as contaminating samples, right? The examiners were making an attempt to clean. It wasn't like they just took, didn't clean at all, right? They were making an attempt to clean. There was just something about it that was slightly insufficient. So a small portion of that DNA got left behind.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. That's makes sense to me. And I only have one other question, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Okay.
Can I ask a question about the cleaning? Sorry, Kathy, can I ask a question while we're talking about cleaning?
Please.
So it says in the root cause analysis that the testing that was done was cleaning by dipping the scissors in a conical tube, followed by water and ethanol. So can you just walk through, like, you dip it in the bleach and then you dip it in ethanol and then you wipe it off? Is that correct?
Yeah, so our standard is they make 3 conical tubes at the beginning of the day, one with 10% bleach, one with DI water, and then one with 70% ethanol. They put the scissors or the tool into the bleach for a certain amount of time, swirl it around, it's open and close any scissors. Then they'll put it in water to kind of rinse off the bleach, and then put it in ethanol to kind of help rinse all of that off and do a final wipe with a clean Kim wipe before using the tool.
So that was one of my next question was opening and closing them. In a conical tube, can they open the scissors to the same extent that they're opening them when they're cutting items of evidence? Because there could be a physical limitation to the access of the bleach if you're in a narrow conical tube.
It's a 50 mil conical, so you can open it maybe halfway. Okay. And if you're cutting the swab, it's comparable.
Okay.
But again, we've re-emphasized for the use of scissors to ensure that you do cleaning very well, keep it in the bleach for a certain amount of time, and the majority of the samples that we do get are swabs from the NYPD, so we're using the disposable scalpels for the swabs.
No, yeah.
And so were these cases of scissors or swabs, or if these are all?
The ones that were detected were scissors, because before that, before the evidence exam pause, we were not really using disposable scalpels extensively.
And I have one other question, but I don't know if Kathy wants to go first. If it's about lab processing, I have a question more about after action.
No, thank you. I just want to follow up on what they just said. I don't know if if you've already checked and you're confident that your dipping in the conical tubes works, I mean, another option might be to first wipe down the scissors with a bleached Kim wipe, to really kind of wipe stuff as well as the bleach and then put it in the conical. Just a thought that might be something. I mean, it's extra time and it might not be necessary, but I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will
And
take that under
Kathy,
advice.
can I follow up with that? Because when I was reading this, and thank you for your explanation and the root cause analysis report. Did they label those conical tubes as bleach, water, and ethanol? Were they easy to tell the difference between them?
Yes, they definitely, they're required to label them, and they put their initials and date to, ensure that they're using the one that they made that day.
And everything's disposed of at the end of the day, so there's no chance of it being used again the next day.
Correct.
So for the proficiency test during the training or retraining, you had high samples, low samples. Will you continue a practice like that periodically for their proficiency test?
We saw that as a recommendation in the root cause analysis report. We haven't actually discussed that, but we'll likely do some types of refresher periodically.
When they take their other proficiency tests, or it might be worth the time to do it, just as a reminder of their habits too, that they're getting tested on that.
I just ask another question. Is there a way to track the sample to sample local hits that you get, you know, you fill in a form that says, were these processed at the same time? Can you go back to look at your old profile hits before this started happening? Is there a way
Yes,
to
we can
query
pull
that?
we can query our local hits that we have produced out of the CODA software. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, if you were going to ask, did this happen? You know, has this happened in the past? Is that a way to start to kind of take a broad brush look at that?
Yes, we're able to pull that information out of CODIS to get the local hits, but then we would certainly have to go case by case and dig into each case manually at that point, but it's feasible to at least get the list out of CODIS.
And we are still investigating and we're still taking look backs. So there may come a time when we realize where there's a boundary line to when these incidents might have started. So, but we could certainly take into consideration looking even back before that boundary line.
Yeah, I just thought that might give a peace of mind, right? If you said, hey, we've looked back so far to all the hits, and they are not related to processing at the same time.
Right, and as Tiffany said, part of our DNA hit checklist, the analysts are instructed to take a look at whether or not they were processed at the same time. So at least we have that was already in place. But like you said, it could be something, peace of mind, that we'll take a look at as well.
Any other questions? Catherine?
Yeah, I was wondering if you know this yet, you may not know this, but for the cases that were contaminated, the items that were contaminated, well, first, were they mixtures? Was it like the contaminating profile was in with a profile that may have actually been from the item of evidence?
Typically, yes.
Okay, and can these be retested?
It was a mix. So some of them, I think there was a couple of cases where, let's say, it contaminated maybe one stain or area on an item, and we could go and cut a different area of that particular item. But many of them were kind of touched swabs from guns or property crimes. So those we consume by habit, so we couldn't retest them.
But each case, we would look at their circumstances,
right.
and for some of them, there were other samples in the case that could be used, other items that could have been tested instead. And, obviously there's some that were consumed that we, at that point, had to mark inconclusive.
And for the ones that are a mixture, is there anything that could be done with that mixture profile to remove the contaminating profile and still use it?
We do, so we already have in our general guidelines for DNA casework, we do allow for that if there's no alternate sample, right? If there's nothing else that you can use, and it appears that there is usable data, right, to that sample beyond the contaminant profile, then we do allow for using StarMix conditioning on that contaminant profile and reporting the rest. And then our user of the data can determine if they want to move forward with that information.
Kind of as last resort.
Last resort, yeah.
That's how all our validation mixtures are made, right?
Right.
So,
correct.
and we do that a lot.
Can I ask kind of on that same line, are there profiles then that you generated that you couldn't use maybe or wouldn't go into CODIS because they were a mixture and you didn't have a standard? Like, so do you have cases that you couldn't use the evidence because they were contaminated and you didn't realize that they were contaminated from another case?
Sorry, I think I'm having trouble understanding the question.
Yeah,
we did have some samples. Yeah.
Articulating what I'm thinking, but if you had a case that was contaminated, it's now a mixture that you wouldn't use. because it was contaminated. And you didn't realize it was contaminated in the lab, and you thought, hey, this might have just been a mixture when it came in.
Yes, there were some cases where we had initially issued reports that said this is just a mixture suitable for comparison, for example, on a property crimes Oregon swab. And then when we did our investigation, we determined that there was contamination within that particular sample. And so then, like Craig mentioned, we would have the analyst for that case evaluate the samples on a case-by-case basis to determine if any of the samples within that case are usable. And, you know, some may be determined to be inconclusive based on the quality reasons, and some may still be usable and reported out, and we would issue an amended report in those instances. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so maybe there are cases that are contaminated and are not in CODIS. So if you did, you know, if you just looked at local matches, you wouldn't see them because those samples, those profiles aren't in CODIS.
Correct, right. So CODIS was our first, you know, our local match was our first way of detecting that something was going on. But then over the course of the investigation, we manually looked at every single sample result, right? So every mixture, every sample, regardless of whether it was in CODIS.
Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. Okay.
Yes, it was a little over 3 months worth, so more than 12,000 samples that we have evaluated thus far, 3,700 cases.
Mike, I have one last question.
Sure.
It's a little bit different related. So in the RCA causes and contributing factors, there's a statement about the RCA group looked at the workload of the analysts, and it was stated that the daily batch size is 55 cases. The forensic biology managers reported that's been consistent since April of 2023. So I have two questions about that. You know, one is, you know, what was it before April of 2023? In other words, it is consistent, but it seems like that kind of does maybe coincide to when you started noticing these things may have happened. So maybe it is related to the batch size. And my second question related to that is, you know, did anyone actually interview the analyst? Because in a couple of places in the RCA, I see where the group is asking the supervisors of these questions. And I did see you did this great job of doing a survey to your analysts and having them fill it out. But I was just curious if the root cause analysis group interviewed any analysts specifically to ask them about the batch size.
Well, the first question, the batch size, you know, we evaluate on a weekly basis. We actually meet with our value stream managers on a weekly basis to look at the batch size, look at the staff that's available. So it does fluctuate. Obviously, coming out of COVID, we had to reassess with the kind of a backup of cases as we had to reassign staff elsewhere during COVID, and then we're still trying to get on top of some of those property crimes. But you know, the batch size has fluctuated anywhere from 40 all the way up to 60, depending on the week and staff that's available. I think on average we have 15 to 20 analysts that are doing evidence examination for the week. So you know, some people may be on vacation. It may be a short week due to holidays or something like that. So the batch size itself will be determined based on some of those factors. As far as whether the RCA committee interviewed the analysts themselves, I don't think so. Meredith, do you have that information?
I'm not aware that they did.
I guess I would just maybe, my opinion, make a recommendation in the future that I think when we're looking at root cause, it really does help to include the people that were involved too. I mean, there may have been something that would come out of that might have been, you know, enlightening. I think it's I personally think it's important to include everybody in the chain of the issue to make sure we're getting all the information.
Understood.
And
We
Kathy,
did
can I just follow
have,
up on, oh, go ahead, Craig.
sorry, I was just going to add that we did have our supervisors interview the analysts themselves to talk about their examination and cleaning techniques. So, you know, we did have that as part of the process as well. You know, I just have an open discussion asking individuals about how they go about doing their cleaning of the instruments. But I understand what you're saying, Dr. Corrado.
Right, the compiled data was not, it wasn't just a survey, it was actually the supervisors each speaking with their examiners, right, and interviewing them and asking them questions about that. And also for the 9 criminalists, myself and or the QA manager have met with them individually and discussed their, you know, examination techniques, et cetera.
And I just wanted to also bring up that, just to remind that the RCA committee is independent of the laboratory, and it's independently run from the laboratory. So we can supply the committee with information like the questioned analysts and the answers that we obtained, but how they conduct their investigation and their, you know, ultimate conclusions and recommendations is independent of the laboratory.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think if there's a way that you know, this information could be relayed to them, because yeah, it's just my opinion that, especially when we're talking about other causes. So, you know, if it is, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is that they're trying to work through too many cases, you know, it would be good to hear from the analysts. That's just my point. So, and I do appreciate that the root cause analysis committee is outside of the laboratory.
Certainly, and we appreciate that as well, your feedback, and we can certainly relay this to the agency's root cause analysis officer, so they can
Thank you.
potentially apply that later.
I just wanted to follow up, Kathy, on that. So the daily batch size is 55 cases, and then it said forensic managers reported that the batch size has been consistent since April of 2023, and they added that a criminalist typically examines 5 to 21 samples daily. Is that per case, 5 to 21 samples per case? Or I didn't understand how 55 cases translated to 5 to 21 samples daily.
I don't believe that's per case. I believe that's like how many cuttings they're making in a day.
Right.
So
like the sexual assault kit could have 11 cuttings if you look at all the different orifice swabs, dried secretions, underwear. So that one case could have 11 samples, 11 cuttings for the day, whereas a firearms case just has 3 swabs, so it only has 3 samples for that one case.
So
And if they're doing an exemplar, if they're doing an exemplar, for instance, that's a suspect exemplar, that's just one sample. So if they're doing 5 exemplars for the day, then those only 5 samples.
So I didn't understand how a daily batch size of 55 cases related to 5 to 21 samples.
It's total. So if we have, you know, 15 to 20 people who are going to be performing evidence exam for a given day, then there are 55 cases that are in the queue to be examined by that set group of people, not individually, but as a group. And then, you know, each person individually for the day, if they pick up 2 or 3 cases, they'd be between 5 and, you know, 20 samples or so for the day.
they may also
Okay.
be cutting samples. Yeah, they may also be cutting samples. So we mentioned like a kit is screened, like we'll cut all the samples to screen for male DNA. And then on a later date, after the quantitation results are evaluated, someone will go back and cut a few samples for differential that had, you know, the highest male. So they may be cutting samples for a diff from a case from last week, and that's not included in the 55 cases, right? They may be doing recuts from additional cases as well. So that would be included in the 5 to 21 samples daily, but not necessarily the 55 cases for that day that they're working on.
Okay. And then I would just, I think I echo what Kathy said. If this root cause analysis committee is not a supervisor, and if they are not seen as, you know, if they're just trying to get to the root cause, that if they actually interview the criminalist, maybe they may say something else that might be helpful in the root cause analysis.
Understood.
Understood.
Yeah, we will offer up that suggestion.
Are there any other questions for the laboratory? Okay, hearing none, I want to thank the members of the OCME lab for being here and for answering all of our questions. Thank you very much. Our next item is with the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. This is an incorrect association of an offender sample. This is the notification and ANAB acknowledgement of an incorrect association of an offender sample due to a collection error. There were no non-conforming work attributed to the New York State DNA Data Bank. The original letter with the potential association was retracted and a new letter was sent with the correct association. And so the laboratory considers this matter to be closed. We do have members of the lab available to speak. Are there any questions for the laboratory? I don't see anyone.
I have questions. I didn't want to take.
Okay.
Anyone else wants to go first, please feel free. Okay, I do have questions, please.
Yes. Here we go. We've got Dr. Dooley here with us.
Good morning.
Morning, Jill.
Morning.
So I have a couple of questions. The first question though is I honestly feel like there's a lack of details with this notification. I'm kind of just, it's hard to even know. I have some questions, but it's hard to know. Could you explain exactly what happened here and when it was notified and what was done about it?
Yeah, so completely understandable. First, I want to start off by saying that the process itself involves a lot of different partners, right? So this wasn't just an issue of we found this error, we rectified this error, and then issued a letter, right? So to be honest, it started with a local lab reaching out to their district attorney. And with that, we were unaware of that. And it's my understanding at that point, then the district attorney reached out to DCJS and they did some investigating. And then we were brought into the mix, right, to find out, was there a duplicate sample? Because inherently with recidivism, we will get duplicate samples submitted. Could we possibly test that and kind of solve the mystery as to what potentially was occurring? When we recognized there was not a duplicate sample, I believe DCJS noticed that the person was in custody and that a potential recollect was possible, right? Also note that this was actually an out-of-state event. So that's why it really didn't involve the state CODIS administrator at all. So it initiated because of an out-of-state hit, I believe. With that, we got the out-of-state recollection, and that's when we came into the fold, awaiting the recollection, processing the sample, and then running what we do with DCJS as an offender-to-offender hit report. And when those two did not align and they did not hit is when we now can further say that it's suspected to be a collection error, a sample swap at the collection level. And so with that, we thought it was important to make that notification just of the general outline of what it was. Again, there was nothing non-conforming within the umbrella of the state police or the umbrella of the state CODIS portion of it, but wanted to make notification. I can't speak on behalf of how all of the other intricacies of the local lab or the district attorney or DCJS's investigation kind of went, or the discussions that were had. But I can just say that from our standpoint, once we were notified, the suspected sample that there was an issue was removed from the searchable index. We awaited the recollect and, you know, continued to communicate with the other partners that were involved with this. Not sure if that's helpful.
Oh, it is. Thank you. So I guess my follow-up questions would be, one, you know, when was the sample collected? I mean, my understanding is from the inception of the database that there were fingerprints that were collected at the same time, and a fingerprint comparison would confirm that you had the correct offender. And then secondly, from when this was collected till now, you know, were there other associations made with that offender?
So going to speak a little bit because I know the process, right? Because of having my previous role. The biometric portion was not required until I believe it was 2019 when I implemented that, when again, as a result of other corrective actions, right? So while there may have been biometrics that could have been confirmed at that point, it was not a requirement that those be processed and that those be confirmed prior to the green light for processing the offender sample. This sample was collected quite some time ago. I believe, I don't have the date off the top of my head, early 2000s, right? So we're talking quite an extensive period of time. Through communication with DCJS, it was found that there was one investigative lead that was issued that was relevant to this sample, and there was a retraction letter, I believe, that they were issued. We were notified of that.
Jill, do you know how it happened? What happened?
I mean, we can only speculate that it was a collection error at the facility at the time of collection. Having not, you know, we're not there to see it. And also knowing in my previous role in dealing with all the collection sites that, you know, it does happen. But that again is why these other measures have been taken, and that we do ensure that the fingerprints are taken, the biometrics are confirmed prior to the approval for us to now process that sample at the state police side.
So I always think that if there's like if you've identified one sample that's wrong, then there's the corresponding sample in the switch, right? That's probably also wrong. And I didn't know if there's any way to go back and say, hey, if you were lucky, there were only 2 samples that were collected on that day, and you can identify that other sample or not. And I don't know if I'm making sense in my thinking here.
Yeah, so again, from our perspective at the state police side of just processing those samples, we believe DCJS is aware of other samples that were collected that day.
Okay.
And I think that they're still perhaps investigating it, but I don't want to speak on their behalf.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm a little bit concerned about an association. So if there was an association made, has that jurisdiction been notified? Is it the same one that we just had, or was there another one? And if so, was that jurisdiction notified? And secondly, and I appreciate, Jill, certainly that the data bank, that the New York State Police, this is a collection issue, not an issue with you, but I guess maybe it's more, I would ask DCJS, you know, is there a corrective action in place? Because from what you said, it wasn't required to check the biometrics until 2019. That surprises me, but so are we going back to look at, is there any way to look at past samples? Man, you mentioned the duplicate matches. I always thought that was a great QC check. So I mean, I suppose if you have a lot of duplicate matches, retrospectively, you've looked at a lot of cases, a lot of collections that they were correct. But, you know, is there any kind of corrective action going on with this?
I just, before perhaps anyone else from DCJS speaks on that, I do want to say that when there is a potential association, and again, this is just an investigative lead, right? A hit does not mean that we are, you know, encouraging them to go out and arrest on this alone. It states directly in the notification that this is just an investigative lead. But prior to that letter being issued, there is a confirmation that is done at the DNA databank side of things that we are confirming indeed that the reanalyzing that profile and working with the local lab. So, you know, we do have that QC side of check in addition to using those duplicate samples as QC check throughout the year.
I think that's great. I mean, I'm grateful that you have that important QC check, but that wouldn't allow you to find a collection switch, right? Because you're just reanalyzing the same sample that you were given. Is that correct?
Right, but there is a report that's run in conjunction with DCJS and the state police called the Offender to Offender. I believe that's run on a weekly basis. So we are QC checking in that sense, in that if we do have two samples that the profiles are matching, we take a look at it, confirm that indeed that is the same NICID, that is the same offender sample, and that they should indeed be matching. And if they are not, then clearly a red flag has been raised, and then we look into that further.
And thank you, that makes sense. And so as far as the notification, if there was a notification that was there a notification that was made to the agencies that this association was incorrect?
I believe DCJS did issue a retraction letter for that initial association.
Okay. Thank you.
So I can confirm that, Kathy. Yes, there was a retraction letter issued. And just for the record, the biometric confirmation, it's 2017 that process started. Just want to make sure. Yeah, that's okay. Just wanted to make sure we're clear.
Was there anything that was ever done like retrospectively with that biometric check? Does anyone know?
In what regard?
The biometric check is now done. Sorry, Shelley. The biometric check is now done again when associations come up. So as a QC check, and I believe this is still in place, but for approximately 6 years, it was in place that we would use the State Identification Bureau from a DCJS perspective to send those biometrics to be confirmed while the confirmation is being done at the state police and local level side, if they're available. Again, I will say, I'm juggling here, and I don't want to speak on behalf of DCJS, but I also want you to know there is there was a time when Digiscan was used, and those were digitally captured, so that you're not able to go back and confirm those biometric samples. That was a specific period of time, but for those that are now done, they are required to ink and roll on the submission form.
And those are only checked when there's an association, which makes sense. I mean, you're not checking them on collection.
No, they are checked on collection. It's a requirement at collection. There's an automated process that that DCJS does on their side with the collection forms, that they utilize their State Identification Bureau, and that they are checked against the fingerprint system. And then once that is confirmed, then we are given approval to start processing the sample.
I see.
So that's done upon collection, and then there is a confirmation again when an association is made.
Okay, double check. Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any other questions?
No, I was would just be interested in if there was a small number of collections that day, if that association, if they can identify who that association really would be with. But that's outside the scope of the laboratory.
Okay, good. Yes, good point. Okay.
I have a
thank
point
you.
of, just a point of clarification I'd like to ask is, I understand that the commission and DNA subcommittee has oversight of the laboratories. And does the DNA subcommittee have oversight of the data bank? So in other words, is the processes that happen in DCJS under the purview of the DNA subcommittee as well? I don't know if maybe Colleen knows that or someone else.
Can you state the question again, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll try to state it more in a better way. Does the DNA subcommittee have authority or purview, is part of our responsibility oversight of the DNA data bank as it pertains to the functions that DCJS performs?
It depends is maybe the answer there. I know that's a very lawyerly answer, right? But I think in certain areas, I would say no for sure. But in other areas, I would say it has to relate specifically to the DNA. I mean, we're not doing the testing, right? So, but there is maybe a little bit of room in the process as we work with the state police.
So I guess, yeah, so I guess that's where I understand that. That's where my question came from. It's a little confusing. So like, here's a collection issue, which did not have anything to do with the state police, but does affect the data bank. And so, you know, if there should be a root cause or corrective action done, like whose responsibility is that? And then, you know, does that have anything to do with the DNA subcommittee or not?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to think that. Go ahead.
I just, from the operational perspective, we do take it seriously and we are looking into it. And improvements to the system have been made over time, including like this improvement that was made in 2017. You know, our staff provides training to collectors and to improve the system over time. And when we've done a lot of outreach, I think unfortunately, like we don't have oversight over collectors, but we do provide the training and information to improve collections. And we are looking into this situation. I don't know if that provides any alleviation of your concerns, Kathy, but.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I appreciate that. And yeah, I assume that DCJS was looking into it. I think, you know, I think my question was more over the oversight, and I understand what Colleen's saying. I think that is, you know, it is an interesting, it's not clear exactly how much oversight the DNA subcommittee would have on certain things in the database. Thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dooley, for joining us on this issue. Our last item is the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. This was an initial notification and ANAB acknowledgement of a mixture interpretation discrepancy between a biological sciences initial report and supplemental report. Upon review, additional cases were found to have interpretation results corrections caught during technical review. The analyst has been removed from casework and the laboratory is investigating. We do have members of the lab available. Are there any questions for the laboratory? Okay. Doesn't look like it.
I have a question.
Yes.
In am I understanding it correctly that a case was issued that had a 3-person mixture instead of a 2-person mixture? Is that correct? Or was it not issued?
It was issued as a 2-person mixture, and then upon supplemental report, when an additional exemplar came in from another elimination sample, when that review was performed on the first report to do the comparison, they realized that it should have been issued as a 3-person mixture.
So then the way that I look at it, there are really 2 issues. One is that the initial call was incorrect.
Yes.
And then the second one was that it wasn't caught.
Yes.
I have a question. Was this, are you using Star Mix in your lab? Was this a manual interpretation or was it using Star Mix? Either way, you have to determine knock. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the knock was outside of StarMix, the number of contributor, and then it was run in StarMix. Upon review with the supplemental, when they had to go back to the original StarMix run, that's where they noticed some unintuitive information within that run that, again, wasn't caught with the first report.
Excellent. That's kind of what I thought had happened. Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Mandy, did that address your question as well?
Yeah, so then, so you're still looking into this, is that correct?
Yes, we're still in the middle of investigation and retraining.
Okay, so I just wasn't clear if it was the two different aspects or just the analyst aspect, but sounds like you're gonna have you're looking at both aspects.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay.
Does anyone have any other questions for the laboratory? Okay, thank you all for joining us. The next item on the agenda is executive session. So we will have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to current investigations or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person. Do I have a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Dr. Smith has made the motion. Do I have a second?
Okay.
Dr. Gettings has seconded the motion. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is aye. Dr. Bieber.
Fred Bieber, aye.
Dr. Corrado.
Aye.
Dr. Gettings.
Aye.
Dr. Kidd.
And Kid, aye.
Dr. Smith.
Aye.
And Dr. Sozer.
Amanda says her aye.
So at this point, if you're not a subcommittee member or staff, we would like to ask that you remove yourself from the room and the virtual meeting will be paused. We will resume the stream when the executive session has ended.
Okay, we are now being recorded and are back live on YouTube.
Are we muted currently?
We can hear you.
We're just waiting for public. If you want to hold on. Is that everybody? I mean,
I think that there's votes but no people, so I don't.
okay.
My colleagues and someone else. I'm not sure where they went. They seem to have disappeared.
We could leave the door open.
Yeah.
I mean. Says we're open.
Used to all the new things.
I know.
I know, it's.
Okay. All right. Welcome back. We're back now. We had no action to take in the executive session. Are there any final comments for today? Okay. If not, the next meeting of the subcommittee will be on February 7th, 2025. We will give more information about the location as we get close to the meeting, but it will be here, from what I understand, in the city. At this point, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
I have a motion from Dr. Smith. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Dr. Gettings. So when I call on you, please state your vote. My vote is aye. Dr. Bieber.
Fred Bieber, aye.
Dr. Corrado.
Aye.
Dr. Gettings.
Aye.
Dr. Kidd.
And Kidd, aye.
Dr. Smith.
Aye.
And Dr. Sozier.
Amanda Sozer, aye.
The motion is carried. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.